Right. Well, thank you ever so much for coming along. I hope you'll find this interesting. um, I I want to congratulate you actually for very skillfully attending the course just at the right moment, because I've done a number of books before, but they've all been kind of edited collections, different people writing different chapters. I did one book with with one other person, but this is actually the first book I've ever written entirely on my own, and it's quite funny really because when you do an edited collection, it's a real headache. Because you've got 20, 30 people writing chapters, and some of them are late, and some of them are ill, and all the rest of it. And you think, oh, it'd be so much easier just to write it myself. So I finally did, and it turns out it isn't easier. It took a long time, but anyway, so well done. You arrived just in the year when I finally managed to write my own first book, which I'm personally very pleased about. I hope you, if you do buy it and read it, that you find it interesting and useful. I've tried to write it in a in a user-friendly way, but I'll tell you a bit about why I've written it and the way I've written it to begin with. I mean, I imagine, I think most of you are on the early years course, aren't you? And we now know, and I think very well established, even agreed by governments and so on, about how important early childhood education is, finally. And there's increasing professionalisation of the teachers and other practitioners who work with young children, and I think very widely recognised, that if we get it right in early childhood education, that's probably going to set children off, isn't it, on a successful career and so forth. But this has really changed from when I taught myself in early years, which was, as you can imagine, about 13th century or so, a few years ago. Early years education was a complete backwater. We didn't have a curriculum. We didn't have any assessment, etc., etc. It was very, very different. It was kind of a little backwater. Nobody really bothered about it. And over the course of my career, it's completely changed. And I think in many ways, although it was sort of lovely and romantic and free and happy in those days, on the other hand, it was very, the quality was very variable. And I think these days, with all the changes, some of which, have been better than others, but nevertheless think we have finished up with a much more professional approach to educating young children. I think that's a good thing. But the other thing that's been really exciting over the course of my career is the way that the developmental psychology has changed. Because when I was trained to be an early years teacher, the only psychology we did was Piaget. And that was deemed to be, that was it. All you needed to know. Whereas, of course, we now know, well, for a start off, we now know that although Piaget was an enormously influential figure, a lot of his particular ideas turn out, not to be correct. But also, because there's been this massive explosion in the last sort of 30, 40 years in techniques, in things like neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, all sorts of really ingenious techniques that are used these days to investigate what young children can and can't do and so forth, particularly what they can do, developmental psychology has really come on. And so for a long time I've been thinking, you see developmental psychology books but written by psychologists, and they're fairly indecipherable to somebody who isn't a psychologist. And you see other books that are written, by early years educators who know a lot about children, but of course they don't have an in-depth knowledge of the developmental psychology. So for a long time I've been thinking it'd be really great to write a book where we put those things together. And also because, as I've said at the bottom of the slide, there are a few misapprehensions. One, there are many early years people who still think that the whole of developmental psychology is Piaget, which is a shame, because it's often seen as a sort of deficit model of the child. And also there are neuromyths about, people over applying neuroscience work like cognitive style and brain gym and all these kind of crazy things. So I wanted to kind of dispel, some of those as well. So what I've tried to do in the book is basically to try to introduce to early years educators who aren't, psychology specialists, what I take to be some of the really exciting, key, interesting, and very significant ideas that have emerged through developmental psychology, as I say, through all these different techniques over the last 20, 30, 40 years, and show how amazingly significant and important they are in terms of developing, doing the best we possibly can for young children. And I think one of the really nice things about that has been that we've moved away from the rather sort of deficit model of focusing what young children can't do that was symptomatic a bit of the Piagetian sort of era, and very much towards recognizing that actually very often children can do a lot more than we thought. And a lot of the new methods that we use have uncovered that. Often children don't appear to be able to do much, but it's a methodological problem with the research, rather than what children can really do. That makes it, a real pleasure to write about, because it's a very positive message, I hope. And you've worked a lot now with young children. I'm sure every time you go in and meet a new group of children, within an hour or two, you just start to be amazed, don't you, by what such young children can do. And there've been some really nice other books that, after you've read mine, obviously, if you want to read another book about young children, there are some amazing books, and I've just listed 3 there. Tiffany Field's book called The Amazing Infant, Alison Gopnik's book, The Philosophical Baby, and Martha Bronson's book, who's been very, very influential in my own work on what's called self-regulation in young children, that we have talked a bit about before. And I think you can tell from those titles the very positive message they give about young children. My own research, as you know, has been a lot about what is now termed self-regulation. In other words, young children's early and amazing and developing ability to take control of their own intellect, of their own cognitive processes, of their own emotional experiences, and so forth. And in a sense, become independent, develop metacognitive skills that we call them, and become self-regulating learners. And that's really a theme that runs right the way through the book. But obviously, the book has split things up into different areas. And I've split development up into a number of different areas, and they're all very important and they're all very interrelated, but you've got to kind of start somewhere. And I particularly wanted to start by looking at young children's emotional development, because I always felt as an early years teacher, if the children, what made me feel I was doing a good job was when the children were happy and when they were bouncing into school in the mornings, saying, "What are we going to do today? This is going to be great," and where they had a positive view of themselves as learners, where they obviously felt emotionally happy and comfortable, in my classroom and so on. And I think this is the thing, I think everybody will say this, won't they? That if children aren't feeling emotionally secure and emotionally, happy in a situation, then really anything else you do is probably going to be a waste of time, isn't it? So what I've done in this is just a quick review of the book. I thought I'd pick out, because it's a very nicely illustrated book. I'm very pleased that Sage actually spent, money on the book, doing it in colour and allowing me to have lots of illustrations, and I think that really helps. So I'm just going to go through and just pick out a couple of illustrations out of each of the chapters and just say a little bit about them. This one, first of all, on the left there, we've got a picture of the brain. Apparently it's the case that if you start any talk with a picture of the brain, people believe more of what you say than if you don't. Apparently this is true. So I thought that's a good tip. So here we are. In fact, I have actually come across 1 or 2 books recently, bless them, where it's about early years education, and the first little section, it says the brain, and then it talks about the brain, because they know they sort of ought to be mentioning that. But actually, everything they don't say anything about the brain for the whole of the rest of the book. It's kind of a little separate bit. Anyway, the reason why I put this up is, and included this in the book, is really to make the point about, and I think we mentioned this in a previous lecture, about the limbic system. One of the very earliest evolving parts of the brain, before we're even talking about human beings, is the limbic system. And that's this set of glands and little control areas and so forth, right in the middle of the brain, middle of the human brain, and that's the area that is very much involved in the control of the expression and the regulation of our emotions. And I think it's significant that it's a very early evolving part of the brain, because it suggests that, and this is certainly true, we know this from all the neuroscience work now, that the emotional parts of the brain are very, very, very interconnected with every other part. So every time you learn something, every cognitive act, every experience you have has an emotional component. And I think that's really important, particularly when you're working with young children, to recognise that. That whenever they suddenly get something, or whenever they manage to do something they're pleased with, that emotional component is a really important component. I think sometimes in education, emotion is seen as children's emotions are seen as a sort of bit of sort of noise, a bit of interference, really, that we need to kind of keep that out of the classroom, because now we're doing we're learning, But actually, when you start to understand how human beings tick, you realise that emotions and learning are very interrelated. The other picture, this is one of my really favourite things. I was delighted to find this in the process of doing the research I did in writing the book. This is what's called double bedding. And these two little girls were prematurely born twins. And so they finished up being put, this is quite a long time ago, this was, I can't remember the date now, but right back in the 1940s, 1950s time. And they were born prematurely, they were put in separate incubators, and one little girl, the little girl on the right, thrived quite nicely, was putting on weight and so on and so forth, but the other little baby sadly wasn't. Was being, fed and all the rest of it in the same way, but for some reason wasn't thriving. And so one of the nurses had the brilliant idea of, well, suppose perhaps we ought to put them together. And so they put them together and double bedded them, as it's called. And the little girl on the left immediately started to thrive, which is amazing, isn't it? And in fact, this actually symbolises a really important body of work done by one of my heroes, who I write about in the book, a man called Harry Harlow. Actually, there's another book you should read, which has a very fun title. It's called Love at Goon Park. He worked in a laboratory which was actually 900 North Park Lane in one of the big cities in America, Chicago, I think. And the way the 900N was written, if you can imagine it looked like from a distance like it said goon, which they thought was quite funny. So they called the labs Goon Park. And what Harry Harlow showed was that actually emotion is really, really significant, and developed this whole work on what is now known as attachment theory, that children need to feel securely attached. In the book, Love at Goon Park, it's a really quite harrowing book in some ways, because it starts off with writing about children in orphanages in the States and in Europe, orphan children who were put into orphanages, and at the time the idea was that what you must avoid is any kind of infection. And so very often they were put, we're talking about 1920s, 1930s, babies and young children were put in cots, sealed over, and then when anybody came to feed them, they would feed them with gloves on, and so on, So they avoided touching the babies as much as possible. And despite the fact, and it's really quite awful to read, but apparently, this is all as it was, um, despite the fact that they were, that they were fed and watered properly, a lot of these babies died. They lost, a huge percentage of babies, and we now know because they weren't being shown any physical affection. They were just being left isolated, no social interaction at all. They were just being seen as a medical thing. So this symbolizes for me this very important message about the importance of love and attachments and warm relationships, between teachers and young children. So we've got to be professional, but we've got to be, warm and loving too. So that's the message there. The next chapter is about social development. Of course, emotional and social development are very interrelated. But this is another one of my heroes. I think you recognise David Attenborough. And he's talking, this is really where we get a bit of evolutionary psychology. He's talking about the evolution of the brain. And he's talking about the fact, the program is called, it's one of his, it's a series he did about mammals. And the particular episode this is in is called Social Climbers. And it's about primates, who are of course our nearest, ancestors as it were. And this particular program focuses on a troop of baboons. The fact that what primates had, and that we have in spades, as it were, that really made us, such a successful species, is the ability to organise ourselves in social groups. So it's the usual thing. We're not. There are other predators out there who are quicker than us, got sharper teeth than us, etc., stronger than us, and so forth. But what human beings had, and what primates had, was the ability to organise in social groups. And a lot of evolutionary psychologists now believe that, in fact, it was that's what was adaptive, and that's what was selected, according to Darwinian principles. And that's what drove the development of the larger brain in primates, and of course, spectacularly in human beings. And what he's showing you here is, if you can see in the picture, he's got 4 little lumps of plasticine, and right at the end of the program, he has this little talk where he says that, in fact, it turns out that you can predict the size of the social group that a primate or a monkey will live in by the size of its brain, which is amazing, isn't it? So this is the brain of a monkey who lives essentially, on their own. This one lives in little groups of half a dozen. This one lives in groups of 20, and this is a baboon's brain, and they live in troops of about 50 or 60. And a human being's brain, is probably 2 or 3 times the size of that. And we typically can live in surprisingly large social groups and organise ourselves. So this chapter is about social development and about how young children learn socially, are very inclined to put their early social inclinations. They're very, set up really to be social. They expect people to interact with them. If you want to really upset a little baby, which I'm sure you don't, but you might like to try it as an experiment. Little babies, the next time you get hold of one, they really like to interact with you. And there's an experiment called the still face, where you just don't interact. So you hold the baby, and you just keep a very still face, and the baby gets upset really quickly. And then a minute they get upset, you go, oh, and then you start interacting, and they cheer up again. They're very, set up to do that. And I've gone on to talk about what's called theory of mind, which is children's gradual, quite early emerging abilities to understand that other people have a mind like them, and that's the basis really of effective social interaction, and the role of developing friendships, which are so important, aren't they? In young children's development. The next chapter, which is the middle chapter in the book, and the one that I'm certainly very pleased with, is about this really central role of play in children's development. And I've talked to you about this before, haven't I? And I've developed this model of 5 different types of play which seem to serve different purposes, and so on and so forth. Physical play, play with objects, symbolic play with language, and so forth. A lot of what we see of play in young children, pretense, or what's called socio-dramatic play, where you're dressing up and pretending to be firemen or whatever, and of course games with rules. And this fits into the kind of evolutionary argument, because of course one of the things we've done is we've evolved to have this very long period of childhood compared to any other species, and what we now understand is that enables this kind of long period of playful behaviour in which we're developing flexibility of thought, creativity, problem-solving abilities, and so on, that make us so unique as a species. One of the other, the two pictures I've picked out is one of my all-time favourite children's drawings. Drawing is a nice example of what's called symbolic play. So that here the children are playing around with ways of representing, their world. So you can do it. You can represent things, through the medium of dance, or you can represent things in language, or you can represent things by making pictures of them. And this particular picture, you might think, oh, he's obviously been very influenced by Picasso there. You know how Picasso does this thing of seeing, it'll be called a woman or something, won't it? And it'll be a woman, but from all different angles, and it all looks a bit chopped up. Well, young children naturally do that because they're trying to represent what they know about something rather than what it looks like. And so you tend to get, the horse from the side, the wheels have to be put out so you can see that they're wheels, and the people have to be lying down in the cart so that you can see that they are people. You can't. It's all put in different angles so you can represent each element in the picture as clearly as you can. And this other picture illustrates another point I wanted to make in the chapter, which is that although we can divide play up into these different sorts, and they all have their very strong purposes in terms of learning and development and so on, actually when you watch children playing, they slip from one to the other very, very quickly. It's quite difficult to actually separate them out. So very often when children are involved in what you might call play with objects or constructional play, they're also got some sort of little fantasy world going on, in their heads, and they're making up a story about the things that they're building and so on. So that's that. And then we go on to looking at memory and understanding. And of course, it's very important to understand how young children's memory abilities develop, because very related to understanding and developing knowledge and so forth. And this is a diagram I came across a long time ago, and I love it because it demonstrates the idea so well. Looks a bit like a neural network, doesn't it? Almost, but actually, it's a graphical representation of a 5-year-old child's knowledge about dinosaurs. And of course, many young children are fascinated by dinosaurs. And what this experiment showed was what they did. They asked the child what he knew about all different dinosaurs. And they did this by a technique where he had to pick 2 dinosaurs and say what was the same about them. So all the lines represent similarities between different dinosaurs. So he obviously knows a lot about Triceratops and Stegosaurus, but surprisingly little about pterodactyls, which I was surprised by actually, because they're the exciting ones that fly, aren't they? If you've seen Jurassic Park, you know what a pterodactyl is after you've seen that. Anyway, so they produced this sort of map of what the child knows, and then they gave him lists of dinosaur names to remember. And they discovered that the ones he knew most about were the ones he found easiest to remember if they're in a list. And that tells us quite a bit about the relationship between dealing with new information and remembering things, and whether it's something we know something about. The adage that you're often told is start from what children know. If they're going to make sense of it, they're going to remember it, they're going to understand it, you need to relate it back to things they already know. And this experiment really demonstrates something about, the mechanisms about how that works. And of course, now we know that knowledge is basically built up in the brain as neural networks, and that when you have the perception of understanding something, it's because you can link this new information to something you already know. You know, that all starts to make sense. Okay, and the penultimate chapter is about moving on to the much more sort of intellectual side of things now, the cognitive side of things, the really significant role of language in learning. And in the chapter, what I've tried to do is review all the things we know about different ways in which human beings learn, some of which are not language-based. So I start off with things like learning by induction, sometimes called pattern learning, how you learn your own first language just by spotting patterns, learning by analogy, transferring one thing to another. But again, the really significant thing is about social interaction. So this is a lovely experiment carried out by a chap called Trevarthen a long time ago about imitation. So this is the other thing you can do with your baby when you pick them up. You get these things called Proto Conversations, where you make a face, you know, so you stick your tongue out, you know, and the baby does it back to you, and then you do something, and so on. And you finish up having this little kind of conversation. So you can see here there's a series of pictures of what the dad did and how the baby responded, or sometimes what the baby did and then how the dad responded. You'll find we're kind of evolved to do this. If you pick up a baby and the baby blows a raspberry, what do you find yourself doing? You blow one back, don't you? You know, it's sort of natural. You can't stop yourself, just naturally starting to interact. And that's a very adaptive system to help the young child to start to learn about language and communication. This other diagram here is about a very key experiment that Jerome Bruner did. It's called the 9 glasses experiment. And I think I've probably talked to you about that before, and shows really nicely the children who've got the vocabulary to describe the glasses are the ones who can play around with the pattern and change it, and so on and so forth. So the language, the symbolic representation of the pattern, really sort of, you know, helps. You can see the beginnings of what we might call abstract thought. One of the other things that I'm doing a lot of research about with my own PhD students at the moment that I think is really interesting is the thing there called private speech. One of the fascinating things, if you're going to be working with 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds, that you'll see young children doing a lot, is this business of talking to themselves as they're doing something. You know, they do these kind of self-commentaries, don't they? You know, what they're doing. And we now know pretty certainly that this is quite an important part of learning to think, you know, inside your head, because it's a kind of external form of thinking. So, you know, according to Vygotsky's ideas, first of all, you know, thinking is done socially with an adult, perhaps. You know, if you're doing a jigsaw, you talk about what you're doing, and then the child learns to be able to do it on their own, but needs to talk about it out loud to do it before they can finally manage to do what we all do as adults, which is talk through things, you know, in our heads. So it really makes the point about how significant talk between adults and children is, which of course was not something that Piaget promoted, and talk also a bit about what Neil Mercer has described as exploratory talk, about children using language for thinking. And then the final chapter picks up on this big main theme of self-regulation. And this is a key diagram, this is a key sort of model of how at any one time in relation to any task we're doing, we've got 2 levels of operation. We're doing the actual task at the object level, but at the same time we've got a representation of the task or the goal of the task in our heads at what's called the meta level. And so there's this kind of very nice kind of controlled feedback loop going on all the time in our heads of us monitoring how well we're getting on with the task, And then if it's going fine, we just carry on. But if there's a problem arises, oh no, this isn't working, then the meta level would change our strategy of doing something, and then we'll change the way we're doing something. So I'm sure you all will have had what's called a moment of metacognitive awareness during the course. There must have been a moment when you were reading something that you had to read, and it's late at night, and you suddenly realise that your eyes are passing over the page, yeah? But actually nothing's going in, and that's when you suddenly, so you're monitoring what you're understanding all the time and what you're not, and you learn to do things about. And children, are doing that really from very young, but obviously not very well. And in the chapter I write about things we can do to help children to develop to become more self-regulating learners, which is so important. And this is just a lovely example from a very old experiment a long time ago, 1975, done by a Russian lady called Istomina, and which I've talked about in the book. And it's a nice example of a child who knows when she's forgotten something, changes her strategy. Did I show you this before? And I think I did. Yeah. Remember she starts off by nodding her head, and that doesn't work when she's trying to remember things. So then she starts whispering things and so on. And a very and she's a child who's just 5 years of age. Doing some very sophisticated things in terms of monitoring her own performance on the task and then changing the way she's doing it in order to do it better. So it's a very nice demonstration of the model. And I also make the point in the chapter that this isn't just about developing as a learner just in the purely cognitive sense, but we can see it also in terms of children's emotional development. And again, I think I might have did I show you this video of the child putting on the jacket? Which is such a lovely example of a child, learning, being supported to persist, and learning not to give up, when he faces difficulties and so on, and really learning, being supported by the teacher to regulate his emotional frustration with the task, and to pursue it, and finally to put the jacket on successfully. And the teacher models beautifully, what one would describe as good scaffolding. Okay, and the thing I want to finish off with was saying the other really big important theme I think for the book is that young children are powerful learners, and our job is to be there and help them and support them along the way, but all the time to recognise, that if that we're there to support them and to liberate their amazing powers of learning, and not get in the way, really. And if you want to be convinced of what young children are really capable of doing, I think on about page 130 in the book you'll find this web link, and it's about 5 minutes long, and it's a 3-year-old little boy called Jonathan conducting the 4th movement of Beethoven's 5th Symphony. And got any musicians? Know how that goes? It's I can't remember. Yeah, it's a very famous piece of music, very complicated. And he's standing there with his baton, and he conducts it, and he's just stunningly good at it. The website's fabulous because there are all these internationally acclaimed conductors who've seen this and just say, "Wow, if my students were as good as this," and so on, But it really, he's in a very musical family. He's being supported by his parents, but it just shows you, given optimal conditions, what a child as young as 3 is capable of, and how big lesson for us all there about not getting in the way, really. Okay, well that's it. Thank you ever so much for coming, and if you would like to buy one now, I'm very happy to sign books for a bit or whatever, but do feel free to go or have another cup of tea or whatever you want to do. Okay, thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.